Every year, around the end of April, a debate erupts online, in diaspora communities, in history classrooms, about what really happened when the Vietnam War ended. The official story says liberation, reunification, victory. But for millions of South Vietnamese, soldiers, civilians, refugees who fled by sea, the story is something very different. It's a story of purges, broken promises, erased cemeteries, and a government that spent decades trying to rewrite not just history, but memory itself. Today, we're going deep into what actually happened after the fall of Saigon, and why it still matters over 50 years later. On the morning of April 30th, 1975, North Vietnamese tanks crashed through the gates of the presidential palace in Saigon. The Vietnam War was over. More than 30 years of division, conflict, and foreign intervention had come to an end. The North Vietnamese government, the Vietnamese Communist Party, or VCP, promised national reconciliation. They promised fair elections. They promised to bring the country together. They did not keep those promises. What followed was one of the most systematic campaigns of political suppression, cultural erasure, and forced displacement in modern Southeast Asian history. Almost immediately after taking control of the South, the Communist Party launched what we can only call a political purge. Every Southern resident had to file a document called a Li Lich, a personal history statement. You had to declare your class background, your family's political activities, your connections to the former government. It was basically a loyalty test on paper. If your file was flagged, if you had a bad profile, the consequences were severe. Your children could be denied access to public schools. You could be barred from working in the state sector. Your future was constrained from the moment you picked up a pen. For former soldiers of the South Vietnamese Army, the ARVN, and officials of the Saigon government, it was worse. They were accused of serving a puppet government and a puppet army. Those labels weren't just insults, they were administrative designations that determined your fate. More than 1 million Southern residents were sent to re-education camps. Some were detained for years. Some until the mid-1980s. They were forced to do self-criticism sessions, ideological study, and hard labor, and families deemed unreliable. They were relocated to what the government called new economic zones, remote, undeveloped areas far from their communities. Officials said these zones were designed to employ the poor and supply food for the hungry. Refugees who lived through it called them something else: barren labor camps. The purge wasn't only political, it was cultural. The new Northern administration moved quickly to classify South Vietnamese music, books, magazines, and academic publications as poisonous or reactionary. They were confiscated, burned. Yellow music, the romantic, melancholic, popular music of the South, was banned. Too decadent, they said, compared to the state-controlled revolutionary songs of the North. Even books by Jean-Paul Sartre, the French philosopher who openly opposed the American intervention in Vietnam, were banned, because his existentialist philosophy didn't fit the party's ideological program. But perhaps the most haunting part of this cultural campaign was what researcher Martin Grossheim calls the condemnation of memory. Statues of South Vietnamese soldiers and politicians were torn down. Burial sites were demolished. The memorial statue of the South Vietnamese Marines, which once stood in front of the Saigon Opera House, was pulled down. The Mac Dinchi Cemetery, which held the remains of leading RVN politicians and officers, was leveled and turned into a park named after a communist martyr. And then there was Bien Hoa. The National Military Cemetery in Bien Hoa was the final resting place of approximately 16,000 South Vietnamese soldiers, people who fought and died for their country. After 1975, it was renamed Bin An Cemetery, transferred to military administration, and then abandoned, allowed to decay. Families of fallen soldiers were denied access. They couldn't visit graves, couldn't make offerings during traditional Vietnamese commemorations. Tombstones were stolen. Graves became overgrown with weeds. For families of ARVN veterans, this wasn't just neglect. It was a message. Your people, your sacrifice, your grief. None of it exists in the new Vietnam. The combined weight of political persecution, cultural suppression, economic crackdowns, and systematic discrimination drove a mass exodus out of Vietnam. They became known as the Boat People, Vietnamese refugees who fled by sea in overcrowded, often barely seaworthy vessels. Many were killed by pirates in the South China Sea. Many more died from dehydration and starvation. It was one of the worst humanitarian crises of the late 20th century. A significant number of those who fled were ethnic Chinese Vietnamese, targeted especially hard after the Sino-Vietnamese War in 1979, and by Hanoi's economic crackdowns on private business. And here's the detail that historian Martin Grossheim highlights that stops you cold. Many of the people who fled after 1975 were the same families who had fled north to south in 1954, after Vietnam was divided at the 17th parallel. They had already escaped communism once, already rebuilt their lives in the South. And now, they had to flee again. They fled their home twice. All of this, the camps, the purges, the burned books, the desecrated graves, was accompanied by an aggressive rewriting of history. In Vietnamese textbooks, newspapers, and television, the Saigon government is still described as a puppet state. ARVN soldiers are framed as American puppets. North Vietnamese soldiers are patriotic martyrs. The war is officially described as a struggle to fight against the United States and save the country. Anyone who frames it differently, as a civil war, or who recognizes the Republic of Vietnam as a legitimate state is actively challenged. Grossheim's research, published in an academic paper titled Reunification Without Reconciliation, Social Conflicts and Integration in Vietnam after 1975, documents how the VCP's propaganda apparatus has maintained this binary narrative for decades. There is one sanctioned version of the war. Everything else is suppressed. It wasn't until Vietnam's economic reforms in the 1990s, the Choi Moi era, that things began, very slightly, to shift. As Vietnam opened to foreign investment and encouraged overseas Vietnamese, Viet Q, to return and contribute to the economy, the government began officially acknowledging their existence. A 2004 Politburo resolution formally recognized the overseas Vietnamese community's potential contribution to the country. In 2005, former South Vietnamese Vice President Nguyen Cao Ky raised the issue of the Bien Hoa Cemetery directly with the Vietnamese Prime Minister during a visit to Vietnam. The late Prime Minister, Vo Van Kiet, a well-known reformist, openly supported the idea of genuine national reconciliation and criticized the government's arrogance in victory. By 2006, the cemetery was transferred to civilian provincial administration. In 2007, President Nguyen Minh Triet, during a state visit to the United States, promised overseas Vietnamese the right to visit the former ARVN graves. Restoration work began. It was real progress, but incomplete. Because here's the fundamental problem, and Grossheim is careful to name it clearly. Reconciliation in Vietnam is permitted only on the parties' terms. The VCP cannot fully acknowledge what happened after 1975 without undermining its own legitimacy. If you admit that the South Vietnamese government was legitimate, you raise uncomfortable questions about the war's purpose. If you explain honestly why 1 million people fled the country, you raise uncomfortable questions about what kind of liberation this actually was. So the party's memory machine continues. North Vietnamese soldiers remain martyrs. ARVN soldiers remain puppets. The boat people crisis is largely absent from official history, and the restoration of ARVN graves, while real, remains incomplete, contested, and always subject to the politics of the moment. Reconciliation, in other words, is not something Vietnam has achieved. It is something Vietnam is still, haltingly, negotiating on terms that the victors set. The fall of Saigon is one of the most photographed, documented, argued about moments of the 20th century. But what happened in the years and decades after it, the purges, the camps, the erased cemeteries, the twice-exiled families, gets far less attention. Martin Grossheim's research is a reminder that ending a war is not the same as healing one. If you found this video valuable, the link to Grossheim's original research paper is in the description below. And if you want to understand more about how post-war states manage, or fail to manage, the aftermath of civil conflict, subscribe and stay with Curiosity Rice. We'll see you next time.